morning USA.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Void Theater. As always, I'm your host Alexander and we're back with another character study. And while it hurts me deeply that we won't be covering the Lich for the second time, stupid polls, but truth be told, I can't think of a better replacement than American Dad, the show that frankly started my YouTube career. And who better to start a character study series on it than the main character himself, Stan Smith. Because the truth is that at the core of the show, Stan Smith represents one of the most controversial defining moments of the show. And that's its change from subtle political commentary to the more standard slapstick wacky show style similar in the vein of Family Guy. This move has been seen as either the smartest decision to make regarding the health and humor of the show, i.e. allowing a wider audience to watch and enjoy it, or one of the worst mistakes the show has made, i.e. dumbing it down to cast a bigger net but losing its originality in the process. And as fun as it would be to restart that war in the comment section again, I'll just leave a link to the first ever American Dad video I did covering what I think changed and whether or not it was a good idea. But what does that have to do with Stan as a character? Well, the thing is that when people often talk about the changes made in American Dad, they tend to focus a lot on the characters and in turn their characterization. And when they talk about that, it's always Stan who's at the top the most drastically changed. And there's a lot of truth to that sentiment. Over the course of the series, Stan has drastically changed from what he was at the beginning to what he is now. But the question, as it always is with a character study, is what caused the change? And that's what I'm here for. So let's break it down. Going over Stan's character over the seasons, how he changed, and most importantly, whether that change did away with the more subtle elements of American Dad's humor. And as always, if you enjoy the video, be sure to subscribe for more content like this. But with all that out of the way, we can begin. So let's put this character on stage and see how he plays out. Alright, so let's start by breaking down the phases of Stan over the course of the series and try to figure out the change. And we can start with the earliest seasons, or ultra-conservative Stan. This was mainly Stan from season 1 to season 6, and is essentially what people think of when they think of the prime example of Stan Smith. This was Stan at arguably his most conservative in the show. He was a Bible-thumping, gun-loving, Bush-worshipping Republican. Now, the interesting thing about this era of American Dad is that this is where most people would argue that the show was at its best with its political humor. And arguably the best reason for this was because of Stan's character in the seasons. He was a perfect wall to bounce off for the family. Whereas he was a staunch conservative figure, the family ranged anywhere from center-right with Steve all the way to hard-left with Haley. But that still doesn't answer the question of what changed Stan over the years. What changed both the show and him from a subtle jab at right-wing politics to a more slapstick comedy form of television? And this is where I'm going to get rather controversial, because I believe that one of the first major changes in the way American Dad handled itself was in this group of seasons. And it's in one of its most iconic episodes, Rapture's Delight.
He turned water into fire.
Now before you try and take my head off my non-existent neck, let me explain myself. I love Rapture's Delight. Like nearly every other fan of the show, I think it's arguably one of, if not the most iconic episode in the series. But remember, we're here to discuss what changed both Stan and the show's tone over the years. And I think that Rapture's Delight is the starting point for that change. Mainly due to the fact that unlike the other odd episodes that came before it, there's no real political humor or subtle jabs at politics of the time. I mean, you could argue that the entire episode shows Stan being a bad Christian, but that's more so just Stan being an asshole than a jab at fake Christians. Now, does that mean that Rapture's Delight was the sole reason for why American Dad started to change as drastically as it did? Obviously not. And as I'll explain later, it was a variety of things. But what I am saying is that this episode was arguably the first time in the show where there was a canon episode that had no real ties to any of the standard tropes and jokes that had been prevalent to American Dad. And it just so happens that the episode that pulled it off ended up being one of, if not its most iconic episode even now, over a literal decade after it aired. So it clearly had a major impact on the show itself. But as we jump to the next part, you'll see it wasn't the last episode to do that. Which brings us to the second phase of the drastic change in both Stan and American Dad itself, the middle or center phase. If the first phase was where the show was starting to show these changes, this is mainly from season 6 to 11. It's a weird in-between spot for the show, one where they didn't quite embrace the insanity of the later seasons, but were already pushing past the political commentary. And like the first phase, it's most obvious with Stan and the episodes that center on him. This is where Stan went from being a hardcore right-wing stereotype and instead became more of a center-right character. It's also where the point of the less political episodes started becoming more popular. Case in point, and a fun little trivia question for the fans here, what season did Ricky Spanish come into the show? Spoiler warning, it was season 8. And that's my point. This phase is where a lot of the things that people say drove American Dad, and to a lesser extent Stan, into the point of randomness really started. This is where characters like Tuttle, Jeff, Director Bullock, and the CIA team really found their footing in the show. They had gone from infrequent one-time showings or split-second appearances into full-on side characters, while people who were more associated with Stan's more conservative jokes like the Mamaris were slowly phased out to quick one-sentence jokes about their existence. And like Rapture's Delight, this ended up being a double-edged sword. On one side, the show gained an excessive number of new characters to play with, but on the other side, it came with the drawback of a massive shift in character focus. Now, instead of the writers creating characters that bounced off Stan's political center comedy, Stan was forced to bounce off the more insane characters that had begun to dominate the show. It's something that I mentioned in my video discussing the influence Roger had on the show, and is also the reason Roger will realistically never get a character study. But the point I made was that when Roger's persona stopped being just costumes that he wore and became full-on alternate personalities, they fundamentally shifted the focus of the show just by existing. Hell, you go to the American Dad subreddit, provided it's still, up and running, and the background is literally all just Roger's characters. So when I say the show changed because of him, I mean it. And just like the change with a more joke-oriented style of episodes like Rapture's Delight, this was a change that ended up being infinitely more popular the longer it went on. And just like that change, it was an extremely popular decision that ended up forcing the characters to fit into a new mold. So now we have a Stan that's jumped from a deep-cut conservative satire into one who's more center-right stereotype that fits into the show because its core has changed so drastically. And yet, when it comes to major changes, it's still not the most defining one. Which brings us to the final phase of both the show and Stan's character arc, the modern or current Stan. Now I think it goes without saying that this is easily the most divisive version of the show, and I think I can say that with certainty because again, I'm still very much getting comments on my other American Dad themed videos that range anywhere from polite disagreement to outright vitriol. And look, I get it. If nothing else, everything I've talked about in this video is proof that the American Dad that we started with is a far cry from the American Dad that we have now. And just like the last two phases, Stan was one who had the strongest change and dynamic. If phase 2 was a small leap into the kiddie pool of insanity, then the modern phase is the show doing an Olympic level swan dive off Niagara Falls. This phase is essentially the show from season 13 to now, and it's mostly noted for not only changing the tone of the show immensely, but also for giving us Rogu. And while I've said my piece on Rogu, there are two other major changes that happened around this time that drastically changed the show. The first being that one of the series' main showrunners had departed the show permanently, and the second being that American Dad had recently moved from its original host channel Fox to TBS. And just for a moment, let's focus on that first one specifically. Now for anyone unaware, the showrunner who left, Mike Barker, to put it bluntly, was the core component for the show's political undertone. In nearly any panel he did at Comic-Con, he would frequently talk about not using the South Park style of current events, but using moments like earlier episodes with Bush and Cheney. He would try to stick to the more political side of the show, and that mindset bled into characters like Stan, because at his core, Stan was essentially a typical Fox viewer. He was a loudmouth, arrogant, pig-headed asshole, and that was the point. In his earliest iteration, Stan was meant to represent the type of people who would watch the network he was on, and Matt Breaker understood that. It's why even when the show started to drift away from focusing purely on that and trying to incorporate more of the nonsensical elements into the show, there was still a semblance of that political satire in the mix. But that all changed when Matt Breaker took his leave from American Dad around season 10 and the show was subsequently sold to TBS. This is this phase's defining moment for both the show and Stan. Because without Matt Breaker and to a lesser extent Seth MacFarlane, and switching from a heavily political network like Fox to a more laid back one like TBS, the show just started throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. It's why we got things like Rogu, Billy, and all the other supplementary characters over the years, and also why the show got goofier and goofier. But by now I'm sure most of you are wondering why I keep talking about American Dad and Stan's changing character like they're the same thing. Well, it's because in a way they are. Every single thing I've listed so far, it was Stan who had the biggest change in character when these moments happened. When the show started to focus on more out there what-if stories like Rapture's Delight, it was Stan who was the central point of them. When the show started to focus more on the side characters, suddenly Stan is best friends with everyone in the CIA, Tuttle, and half of Roger's personas. And when the show started to lean into the more slapstick side of things, it was Stan who was hit the hardest, changing him from a stern Republican father into Peter Griffin with slightly more intelligence. because the truth is that at its core, Stan is American Dad, and American Dad is Stan. When the show underwent some massive shifts in how it worked, Stan underwent those same shifts. In the case of the character arc of both him and the show, we can see that they were defined by 1, a notable increase in viewership from the more outrageous and out there episodes, 2, a strong insistence on including characters that ultimately didn't fit within the tone of the show originally, and 3, the only showrunner who cared about politics departing, leaving only the showrunner who focused on the more random nonsensical humor. So that brings us back to that last question. Did these changes take away the more subtle undertones of the show? And the answer is, sort of. The show has definitely gotten goofier over the years as a result of these changes, but when you look deeper into it, you can see that some episodes still try to retain that more old school feel of the show. Now, does it work? Well, I don't know. That's for you to make a call on. All I can say is that if they put a little more effort into it, they could potentially bring back some of the people who left when the show changed so drastically. But with that, we come to the conclusion of this character study of both Stan Smith and American Dad as a whole. This was a drastic change from my normal character study format, but like I said, you can't really talk about Stan without talking about the show and vice versa. But as always, with the current closing, I'll leave you with some questions. Do you think American Dad has made the right call with the tonal switch for both Stan and the show? And if you could change one thing back to how it was in the original style, what would it be? Leave a comment down below letting me know what you think, and while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more content. Until next time, I've been your host Alexander, and I hope to see you back in my theater.